Hi, and good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes for more people to join, and then we will start. Hi, and good morning, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone joining us. Thank you for making the time to listen to this conversation. The theme of today's webinar is Charles Kindleberger, and here at the GDP Center, we're lucky enough to have two new books that touch on his legacy and that we can talk about today and have a discussion on how Kindleberger's work still is relevant for what's happening in the 21st century. We have the two new books, one from Perry Mehrling, that is Money and Empire, Charles Kindleberger and the Dollar System, and the 8th edition of Manias, Panics and Crashes, that's co-authored by Kindleberger and Bob McCauley. Thank you for bringing the books and showing them. So today we will hear a bit about these books and have a conversation about the work of Kindleberger, starting from the two presentations. So first, our first speaker today is Bob McCauley, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Center, which also, by the way, I realized just as myself, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Lara Mehrling, and I'm currently a non-resident fellow at the GDP Center and a former policy advisor there. And then our second speaker is Perry Mehrling, who is the professor of international political economy at the Pardee School and also part of the GDP Center. And now, please, Bob, if you can start with a brief presentation of your book.
Gladly, Laura, and thanks for that introduction. And I'm thrilled to join Perry and you, Laura, for this event, and I think it's a great pairing, as they say in the wine business. I first met Charlie Kindleberger in 1976, taking his history class, and at that point, the mania that was front and center for Kindleberger was that of the lending boom by banks to developing countries, as the Global South was then called. And there were pretty classic symptoms. Volumes were up and spreads were down. There was clearly a big push from the supply side. And most of the responsible international economists at the time thought it was just fine. It was marvelous. It was recycling. It was maintaining global demand. There were lots of good Keynesian stories being told, but Charlie had seen it before, something like it in the 1920s, figured in his book, World in Depression, and he predicted no good end for it. The book was published in 1978. The difficulties hit the fan in 1982, so that's pretty good prescience on the part of Kindleberger for 4 years ahead. Some people say you can't call bubbles, or if you can call them, you can't call them early enough to do anything about them. Not so. But the book Kindleberger was working on was really, in some ways, a generalization of his 1973 book on the world in depression. And he wanted to take a model, a schema for how things that aren't supposed to happen, that don't happen in textbooks, do happen, manias, panics, and crashes. And he wanted to ransack history for all the important, especially international cases of these, and see whether the schema, whether the model fit. Now, he called it the Minsky model, and I think Perry has done us all a great service by showing just how much of a stretch it was for Kindleberger to call it the Minsky model, and Minsky even sort of resisted the label in real time, but more on that later, I imagine. But the model fit according to the book, and that led to the second point of the book, which is what do you do about these things? And there, the lesson of the Great Depression for Kindleberger was that you really need some powerful financial center to step up to the plate and take responsibility and perform the role of the lender of last resort, lending when the market is falling apart. And in some ways, the book is an attempt to test that policy conclusion against a broader set of data, basically all the crises of 200-300 years later, extended backwards in subsequent editions to more like 400 years. And the finding, tentatively stated, but clearly persuasive to the author, was that having a lender of last resort, an international lender of last resort, makes a big difference to how severe the downturn is after mania, panic, and crash. So that was the 1978 book. And this is the 8th edition, and it's a fair question to me what it is that I thought that I could do in the 8th edition that would make it worthwhile somebody, maybe even somebody who's read one of the early editions, pick up this new edition. And I could tell you that I had some nice insights on the global financial crisis and how much that was a matter of European banks inserting themselves into the credit process in the United States. I could tell you how there were compelling insights about how the Japanese bubble unfolded and why it was probably the worst we've seen in a history of major countries, at least. But the main reason that the book needed an 8th edition was back to the second original intention, which was the international lender of last resort. That had changed very much in this century, in the 2008, and again confirmed in 2020, and that needed to be drawn out. And how did it change? It changed in the Fed stepping up to the plate in a way that would have been inconceivable to most observers, most international economists, except for Kindleberger, over the previous generation or two. In particular, Kindleberger had anticipated or forecast or said it was necessary, at least, that the international lender of last resort lend without limit. Limits excite, said Kindleberger. And so he urged in the 1960s, shortly after the formation of the mutual lending arrangements between central banks, known as central bank swaps, practically as soon as they came into existence, Kindleberger was urging them to be unlimited, and they became unlimited in October 2008. Some said that wouldn't happen again. It happened again in 2020. So that was a huge change. And there was another angle of change that particularly became evident in 2020, which was the Fed moving to support through outright purchases corporate security markets. In 2008, that had been confined to the commercial paper market. In 2020, that was extended to the corporate bond market. And here it was not an international operation, but it was a domestic operation that had clear global effects. The whole dollar bond market, not just the piece in the United States, was clearly supported by the Fed in 2020. So these were huge changes. And in the spirit of the original intention of the book, these changes needed to be brought out and deserved a separate chapter, which is chapter 13. I suppose I have a half minute or so, Laura, at this stage.
Yes.
I can't resist saying, and I couldn't resist writing a chapter on cryptocurrencies. It probably, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't rise to the importance that it really earned a chapter, but it is and was in many ways so remarkable a folly that I could not resist writing a chapter. And that chapter has two themes. One, that Bitcoin is really worse than a Ponzi. It's really a pump and dump scheme when viewed carefully. And second, that the way the whole thing undoes itself is because it ends up, despite its original intention, the crypto business ends up depending on large institutions and the trust in large institutions. And it was very evident, not yesterday with the SEC indictment, or the day before with the SEC indictment, not last fall with the collapse of FTX, but it was apparent, it's been apparent right along that the institutions of this particular mania were not behaving in a way that would sustain the trust, the required trust in them. So the trustless technology is falling as the trust is abused, trust is lost. So Laura, I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to learning from Perry, as I have on many occasions and through
Thank
much
you
of his
so
writing.
much for that short introduction, and we're gonna get to discuss a bit more. And now, Perry, up to you to tell us a bit more about Money and Empire and Kindleberger.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this pairing is interesting, and it brings to the fore the point that if anyone has heard of Charlie Kindleberger, it's probably because they read Manias, Panics, and Crashes. And so viewing him through the lens of that best-selling book, I think, however, doesn't tell you about the man enough. Okay, you need to see him as a much broader person than that. And when you do see him as a much broader person, you read Manias, Panics, and Crashes in a different way, too. So that's what I will try to suggest in the 6.5 minutes remaining to me here. So the broader picture, I think Charlie always emphasized that he had 3 careers. And so this book is organized in the first place as a biography of the man. So there's a first section on his first life, the formation. He did a PhD at Columbia during the Depression, as a matter of fact. So he cut his eye teeth on that, and his dissertation was on hot money, on short-term capital flows. During that period, but he couldn't get an academic job because there were no academic jobs. So he basically became a central banker. He was not unlike McCauley. You haven't mentioned that, but we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. So he started life at the New York Fed. And then went to Basel, to the BIS, not unlike Bob McCauley. And the war interrupted him, and he was an intelligence officer in London and traveled with General Bradley on the continent after D-Day, then came back in the State Department and put Germany back together, I suppose, and then the Marshall Plan. So he was a public servant for 12 years, okay? before he was an academic. And I think that's very important. Okay, we're talking here about somebody whose intellectual formation is in practical experience of being a central banker and working in the State Department. And so he was a different kind of an academic when he came to be an academic than somebody who didn't have that experience. And that's important. That's important to emphasize. So he's a creature of the pre-World War II also. So not a creature of the Keynesian orthodoxy or the monetarist reaction. He's a third way person, comes out of American institutionalism, and he revives that for his second career. He got a job at MIT in 1948, and he was at MIT from 1948 to 1976. As an international economist, and he wrote textbooks and he did lots of stuff. I talk about that in the second section of the book. And he had a number of important students. Bob McCauley, one of them, but Bob Mundell, for example, as well, and others who I speak of in the book. 1976, I just learned that's when Bob first took his class. Well, he faced mandatory retirement in 1976. So by then he was already transitioning to his third career as maybe an economic historian, you could call him. Sometimes he called himself a historical economist. His last book, he called it Comparative Political Economy, a retrospective. It was a collection of his greatest hits. But it was a third career. He was out of academia. He didn't have to be part of the MIT team anymore, and he could go his own way. And he's beginning to do that very much so in 76 already. And Manias, Panics, and Crashes is sort of a declaration of independence in a way. So this is a story about a man, but it is also two other stories. I want to say this about the book, okay? It's also a revisionist history of the dollar system. Remember the subtitle, Charlie Kindleberger and the Dollar System. There's a story that people tell about the dollar system, and Charlie didn't buy it. That it was created at Bretton Woods and so forth, okay? And so that's a longer talk, but essentially he's approaching this whole thing from the key currency approach idea of John H. Williams and prior authors as well. And so each of these turning points he understands differently. 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off of gold, he understands as the crime of 1971. This isn't the breakdown of Bretton Woods. This is about Nixon sabotaging the dollar system and trying to prevent the dollar from being the global currency, which the bankers wouldn't let him. The bankers went on anyway and created the Eurodollar system. And eventually the US gave up and said, okay, and this is Paul Volcker accepting U.S. responsibility in 1979. So this view of the Volcker shock is quite different from the Kindle. I'm just giving you a few little pointers there that it's a revisionist history of the dollar system, this book as well, intertwined with the story of this man. It's his story of revisionist history of the dollar system. And then the third theme in this book is it's a revisionist history of economic theory, of the theory of international finance, of the standard model of Mundell-Fleming, which is basically just an internationalization of ISLM, adding a balance of payments constraint. This is not really how Charlie understood the way the world works. He saw it always as a global system, not individual countries, and the ability of individual countries to kind of manage their own sovereign activities. It's a global system. There's one money market. There's one capital market. U.S. monetary policy is global monetary policy. All of these things that I'm mentioning are explained in the book in more detail. But you can see that this is a revisionist understanding. This is not what you hear in the standard New York Times. He also viewed the credit system as inherently unstable. So he's part of that tradition, going back to Hawtrey and others, that it's not an equilibrium system. In fact, it's a Darwinian evolution system in his mind of institutional evolution. This point that Bob was making about the international lender of last resort. His greatest book, as he said, was The Financial History of Western Europe, and he sees that really is a story about the coevolution between financial innovation in the private sector and then evolution of the international lender of last resort. That they're evolving together and through crises, through fluctuations. So the last thing I'll say is I've come to see Kindleberger. This is not in the book, but I've just written a little paper about Bagehot. Walter Bagehot, who wrote in 1873 Lombard Street about the London money market. And I've come to see Kindleberger as a kind of Bagehot figure. Bagehot was writing right at the birth of the sterling system, okay? Kindleberger was writing at the birth of the dollar system. And they are they see these things as a good thing, but as a responsibility for the central bank that maybe the central bank is not up to, and they're concerned about that. So I think there are deep parallels between the sterling system and the dollar system, between Bagehot and Kindleberger, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And now to kick off the discussion, we are the Global Development Policy Center. So maybe the first question, and maybe this way we also get to the empire part in the title of your book, is getting a bit more into this global system, global dollar system, and what are the dynamics in it and who gets access to what. Because Bob, you also mentioned international lender of last resort and the swap lines, but maybe let's talk a bit more of like within this global system, who gets what and what are the dynamics, because not all countries are equal. Not sure who wants to go first. Maybe Bob, if you want to go first.
Sure.
On talking a bit more on.
So after 2008 and again after 2020, there was sort of cottage industry of scholars who would take as a left-hand side variable the granting of a Fed swap line to a country's central bank, and then would try to put variables on the right-hand side of the equation to predict that. And various, of course, the Fed minutes, the staff gave a rationale for their proposal for which four countries from the global south were included, that had to do with size and integration with the world financial system. But the scholars have put in rather sharper variables like exposure of the US banking system and even political variables having to do with alliances or some sort of military connection. And so the question you ask is who gets it is a live question. What is in the chapter 13, I believe, in the 8th edition of Manias, Panics, and Crashes is a demonstration that the width of the circle that the Fed drew, starting with the central banks that got sort of unlimited access to Federal Reserve credit and extending to those that had still numerically limited amounts, that if you measure it by the importance of the currencies in the forward market, then the Fed's coverage is actually quite high, that you get a very far distance through the foreign exchange market with just the currencies that had unlimited access to Federal Reserve credit. And if you add the other 9, I think, currencies of the countries whose central banks got access to Fed credit, then you get up to well over 2/3 of overall turnover in the foreign exchange forward market. And I guess I also emphasize that there's evidence that it spreads out from the currencies of the central banks that get the access. So the narrow answer to the question you pose is being pursued. It has been pursued by multiple scholars, but I think the broader perspective is that from a key currency perspective, the Fed has huge coverage of the currencies by their turnover in the private marketplace.
Well, so I learned from that. That's interesting. Let me pull back to 30,000 feet a little bit. The question where we started, that Laura was saying, not all countries are equal. And behind that question is a kind of presumption that maybe they should be. And where does that come from? Okay, that's this notion of sovereignty. That's this notion that every country is its own sovereign. That's a Westphalian kind of ancient idea, which is supposed to prevent us from fighting. Okay, that's what it was all about. It's supposed to prevent wars, that you have sovereignty over your own territory. But do you have sovereignty over money? Okay, in a global system where there's arbitrage connections between all countries, I think that presumption needs to be questioned. And it's not even clear that the U.S. is sovereign. As I say, if the U.S. monetary policy is global monetary policy, then it can't just think about what's good for the United States. Okay, it has to think about the globe. So that sort of presumption is one of the things I think that Kindleberger was fighting against. But so here's what he would say repeatedly. The system is hierarchical. Okay, key currency means that it's hierarchical, and that means that the people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy are not going to be too happy about that. And you hear them. This talk about de-dollarization and so forth is coming up. But those discontents are with us always. And that needs to be managed, and it needs to be attended to. I'm not at all saying that we should ignore that, but it is a fact about how the world is organized. And I'll even give a more sort of historical background. Bob was mentioning sort of the current state of play, who gets swap lines and who doesn't get swap lines. I have a little paper about where's my swap line that the GDP Center published. So but where does this come from? So Bob has a great paper showing about the evolution of the dollar system, where during Kindleberger's idea, the big challenge was integrating Europe into the dollar system. That's what he's all about. Okay, is after World War II, and he didn't really live to see the next stages of it, the extension of the dollar system to Asia. Okay, the extension of the dollar system to the global South. This crisis that Bob was talking about in 1982 is part of that. There's and we're experiencing it now since the global financial crisis and zero interest rate policy in the global North. There's been enormous expansion of dollar lending to the global South, and now that's being tested as we're having tightening monetary policy. This is the way the system grows and expands, and more countries sort of move up the hierarchy. Okay, the countries that had no access at all to global capital markets 30 years ago are now issuing bonds. Okay, in dollar bonds in global capital markets. So the system is a Darwinian evolution system. The last thing I'll say about this, I think one of the things Charlie might have said, in fact, he did say, he was reacting to the new international economic order, this call in 1974 of the global South to be treated equally or so forth. He said, well, the way we could help you most, okay, is by getting our own acting gear. Okay, and to some extent, that's what Bob was saying. Okay, that the global North, by preventing this global financial crisis from becoming worse than it was, actually creates policy space for the global South. So and this happened in the COVID crisis, right? That the central banks in the global South, the BIS has talked about this, their currencies did not fall off a cliff as you might have expected they would. The central banks were able to intervene in their domestic markets, even as there was capital flight. And why were they able to do that? They were able to do that because the Fed took care of stability at the center. So it's a more complicated story than the idea that there's 150 sovereign nations who should all be treated equally. It's a hierarchical system, and understanding that that's the system we need to manage, and we're learning to manage. And this is the point that Bob was making about the 8th edition, that actually we're doing a lot better now, okay, than even seemed politically possible. Because of the sovereignty thing, it's very difficult to manage this global system because there's not a global sovereign. That's the challenge, the politics and the economics, squaring that, making that work together.
Yeah, thank you. And now maybe on the debt point too, where Bobby said that like debt in the 80s, that was one sort of mania and it blew up. maybe what are the parallels to the debt accumulation we see today, and the role of the Fed and Fed tightening is playing today, and how are things a bit different or similar to the 80s?
Well, what we had after the great financial crisis with the Federal Reserve and the ECB trying to push down long-term rates was an explosion of bond issuance. And the explosion of bond issuance by the US corporate sector, I think, was very much the intention of the Federal Reserve. The explosion of the issuance of dollar bonds by the rest of the world, not least those from the global south, was not at all intended. And go to a place like Peru, and companies that no one had even heard of suddenly were able to sell dollar bonds. And so how that is all going to work out is we're in the process of finding out, and it's by no means, I think, obvious, as it was already by 1978, that there was bound to be a really broad scale debt crisis among the big borrowers, among the developing countries, as they were then termed. So the overall burdens aren't all that high, and the case for a wide crisis is not at all clear. And what we're seeing mostly is distress and default among the what would you call the extensive margin. So after 2010, there were a whole batch of countries like Ghana that had access to the dollar bond market for the first time ever. And then there were other cases much more significant quantitatively, like one of the biggest dollar bond issuers would have been Petrobras, which had giant holes out in the Atlantic on the asset side of its balance sheet and dollar bonds on the liability side. And we'll see how that works out, but it's mostly, as I read it to date, at the extensive margin, the countries that sort of, by virtue of the willingness of bond market investors to take risk to get incremental yield, that got into the bond market for the first time, that many of those have come a cropper, and that's where the problems to date are acute.
So I agree with that. Let me just add the circling back to Kindleberger, this thing that he calls the Minsky model starts with a displacement, and it's often a war or the aftermath of a war, reparations or something, some very large financial challenge. Okay. Well, the global financial crisis was a big displacement, and ZIRP was a very big displacement. This coordinated zero interest rate policy in the global north, and that led to a sort of classic credit expansion in lots of places. Okay, and the global south is one of them. That is particularly what you're asking for, and now that's come to an end. Okay, and we're finding out how much of that was good lending and how much of that was not good lending. But here's the important thing that Charlie would emphasize. He would say, when you create a new displacement, you're cutting new channels. Okay, he said credit flows across like a level surface, and when you cut a new channel, suddenly it's flowing much more readily than before. And after the crisis, after this settling out that's happening right now, those channels will still be there. Okay, they will continue. The expansion of the dollar system to the global south, I believe, is a permanent thing. Okay, that it was surprising, and in some countries it was overdone, maybe. Okay, or prematurely extended. That's the way the credit system works. Okay, it's inherently unstable system. So that's the way it works. And we're now pruning off. I will say, you were saying that this was no part of the intention of the Fed to do this, but of course it's one money market, it's one capital market. You can't just extend credit to U.S. corporations. It's going to go everywhere. It also went to crypto. You mentioned, okay. It also went to Silicon Valley Bank. There's a lot of zero interest rate policy businesses out there, okay, that are going away, okay, and it's not just Ghana, okay. It's SVB, it's other things like that. This is again a symptom of the stage we're at in this cycle, and I just to add that it's not picking on the extensive margin. There's other margins too that are being pruned off. Okay, at this stage in the cycle. You're smiling, Bob.
Crypto is the extended
Yes.
margin.
Yes.
Thank you. And we're going to move into the Q&A from the audience soon. And if people have questions, they can write it in the box and we'll go over them. And just remember that this webinar is live streamed. But I'm going to do this now because we have a question there from Kevin Gallagher that links a bit to what we just talked about. He's bringing in the IMF and kind of the question on the IMF's role as a lender of last resort, and how initially Kindleberger was a supporter of the IMF in the beginning, but now what would he support the short-term liquidity shots in the arm that the IMF gives rather than structural financing, thus having countries that perpetually go to the IMF when they are on the wrong side of the global credit cycle. And maybe here too, expanding a bit on, we've talked about the Fed as the lender of last resort globally and how they're stepping in, and how the IMF was the institution initially, designed to do that, where countries should have had, a say. I mean, the dynamics are pretty much not that different because countries like Ghana have little say at the IMF, but at least formally maybe a say. And how is that institution's role as a lender of last resort different, or should be different?
Well, maybe let's mix it up. I'll start this time because I think you need to go back to the history, okay, a little bit more. Okay, the idea. Let me Kindleberger was not, in fact, a huge fan of the IMF. He was a huge fan of the BIS, okay, the Bank of International Settlements, which the IMF at Bretton Woods was supposed to kill the BIS. Okay, that was supposed to replace the BIS, and the bankers resisted that, and so we continued to have the BIS. And why was he not a fan? He thought the important thing was the World Bank. Okay, because it was about long-term development finance. He really was a believer in Hanson's stagnation hypothesis that we really need an engine of global growth, and it's got to be the global south. We got to figure out a way to get capital flows to the global south, and it's got to be public in the first place, but maybe priming the pump for private. So he is thinking about the development of the global south is very much an important thing for him. He doesn't see the IMF as lender of last resort, basically because it's not a bank, okay? That a lender of last resort has to be able to step in basically instantaneously when something is happening, expanding both sides of its balance sheet. The IMF can't do that. The IMF is a big bureaucracy. It's got to get agreement from all of its member states. So he never thought the IMF was at all suited to be a lender of last resort. What he thought it was a good place to put these loans after. So the lender of last resort steps in, okay, and then over to solve the immediate problem. And then the IMF maybe cleans up at the end, putting some of that stuff on its own balance sheet. He said things like this in print. And I think that probably remains sort of the case. I mean, the notion that every country somehow should get an unlimited swap line from the Fed, I think is not. These are swap lines are for liquidity problems, okay, not for short-term finance, okay, not long-term finance. He was very interested in development finance. That's not really a lender of last resort problem, okay. He was very worried. The last thing I'll say, and then turn over to Bob. He was very concerned after World War II, okay, that the great needs for finance in the global South was going to cause them to borrow where they could borrow, okay, which is to say in short-term markets. Borrowing in short-term markets for long-term development finance is a recipe for disaster, okay, because then you have to roll these loans. So this is a big difference between 82 and the present. Bob was mentioning, these are bonds, okay, that Petrobras is issuing, okay? These are not 3-month bank loans, okay? So this is a different kind of finance, a more stable kind of finance, possibly. We're testing that right now. So those are just a few random thoughts. That was a lot of questions there, Kevin.
Thanks for the question, Kevin. And
yeah,
I'll just remind Perry and others that John H. Williams, the key currency man, actually testified before Congress against the IMF, I think in favor of the World Bank. So
yes,
correct.
Thank you.
Version of what Perry just said about Kindleberger. There was a discussion one time between Bernanke, Chairman Bernanke, and Congressman Frank after Bernanke had just done some big operation in 2008, and Frank said, "Gee, Ben, where'd you get the money?" And Ben said, "Well, we got a lot of it. We got up to 600 billion," talking about the size of the Fed balance sheet. And of course, uncharacteristically, perhaps Bernanke understated the case. Of course, the current balance sheet size of the Fed turned out to be no constraint at all, and they blew through that into the trillions. So that is just a poignant summary of the difference that Perry just noted between being a bank and being the IMF. So that the first edition of the Manias, Panics, and Crashes was very clear that the IMF was not suited to be a lender of last resort because it was slow, it was limited, and it was conditional. And in the Kindleberger view of what went wrong in 1931, the serial conditions of France, which were political conditions on first Austria and then Germany, played villainous roles in making sure there was no effective international lender of last resort, and that things went really bad. And in particular, historians have connected the failure of a German bank to not bank to the votes for the Nazis in the place where the bank failed. So it really went badly, in particular for France, which was trying to keep Austria and Germany from coming together. So anyway, conditionality in Kindleberger's view is not a good thing. And so when it comes right down to it these days, though, and one of the things that changed in this century is that before it was, as Perry said, that the loans that central banks gave each other through the swap lines were calibrated in size to the possibility of eventual need for the IMF to refinance if the short-term loans couldn't be paid off in the short term. Starting in the year, in this century, though, there's no such relationship at all. The extensions of credit between the Fed and the ECB went way beyond any possible money that the European countries could draw from the IMF. So there was, for most of the post-war history, some linkage between the swaps and the IMF credit, but that no longer is the case. The swaps are really standing on their own, and it really is a sort of separate system with sort of separate collateral, if you will, these days.
Right. I think it's a bit, in my own view, too, that the IMF is relevant just because for some countries in this hierarchy, that's still the only place to go. But what about the IMF's unconditional lending that we saw during COVID? They had a bit of these like unconditional, sort of small in size loans. Like, do you think there's any potential in those or expanding those, or, there's anything there? And just for background, I mean, they have this emergency credit lines that they set up, if there's an exogenous external, countries can get up to, it was, I think, 150% of their quota. So relatively small loans, but the first time that there was a lot of unconditional short-term lending from the IMF.
I don't know so much about that. The thing that I know more about is the rather large SDR allocation, which is now everyone is looking at. I mean, in to some extent, that is unconditional. The problem, of course, is that in order to spend your SDRs, you have to find somebody to buy them, and we haven't really sorted that out. Okay, so despite that huge allocation, not much has been used of that. So it's I think that from a banking point of view, okay, you would not expect. Liquidity problems are liquidity problems, and you want unconditional support for that. The question is, are the problems of the global South liquidity problems primarily, okay, or are they other kinds of problems requiring other kinds of solutions? And pretending that something's a liquidity problem that is not, okay, is actually storing up trouble for the future. Okay, would be my concern about that.
On the SDR, unconditional and cheap, very, very cheap. You pay T-bill rates. So why aren't they used more? Is the question. One answer seems to be that it takes some little while, partly for the reason that Perry suggested, that it's not real money. You need to turn it into real money, and that itself is some sort of bureaucratic process. But I understand it takes weeks between when you make the phone call and when you get some real money in a bank in New York or Frankfurt or wherever in exchange for your SDR allocation. So even when the money is, I won't call it free money because there is an interest rate, but even when the line of credit is basically free and the rates are subsidized or at least very inexpensive for a risky country, the usage is amazingly low to my mind.
So what I can say a bit on the usage, because that's where I wrote the paper with Andres Arauz and Kevin Cashman on the use, actually, and the take-up has been very, very high for developing countries. The problem there is that the allocation is distributed based on IMF quotas. So you have 650 billion, but only about 210 billion went to developing countries minus China. So out of that part, the uptake has been very, very high, and we tracked it a bit because even as you say it's slow, for those countries that use it, it's still the fastest thing there is. So one of the issues, I guess, there is the distribution of why so much of it is untouched, because of course, for the US, the European countries that have swap lines, why would they use the SDRs?
What is the percentage, Laura?
Very high for African countries. I think sub-Saharan Africa was like over 90% of their allocations, what they used. It was very high. I see my colleagues already put the paper in the chat. It has a table
so
tracking.
I haven't
the
read.
uptake.
I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read that paper, but I will. My impression is that some of this, however, is also because you can use SDRs to pay back loans to the IMF. Okay, some of this is not actually new lending. Okay, that this is replacing expensive loans from the IMF with cheap loans.
Yeah. So the table there has the categories. There's an update I didn't work on, a bit newer on what it was used for. But during the pandemic, a lot of these countries that didn't have access to reserves did exchange them and also use them for fiscal purposes and budget supplements. But only in, for the countries that had nothing else available. And also now I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I also feel like maybe we should go a bit we have 2 more questions in the Q&A that maybe we should address. One is on, do you consider the impacts of petrodollars? This was a major disadvantage for many developing countries. Even now, many are struggling to get dollars to import oil. And I'm just going to quickly read the other questions because we have 10 minutes left. So maybe, we can touch on both. The other one is, how do you consider Eurobonds, euro currency, which also spreads dollars around the world? In addition, many developing countries, central banks have to maintain a significant amount of dollars as insurance to deal with global economy shocks like US monetary policy. So maybe we can get a bit into those questions in the next 9 minutes we have left, and then close up with a bit of like an overview of what we touched on otherwise.
Well, maybe I think raising this issue of Eurodollars, okay, is I think important, the most important thing here to appreciate. One of the stories that I tell in the book, okay, is about how immediately after World War II, this idea that we're going to be establishing a dollar system, in Charlie's mind, that was like, well, okay, so how did the sterling system work? Okay, the center of the sterling system was London, and the whole globe came to London to borrow and lend to each other, and that's maybe what will happen now, except that it will be New York. Okay, so he thought that was sort of the natural Darwinian progression of institutional progression, just New York taking over from London in both the short-term money market and the long-term capital market. Okay, and that started to happen, and the New York bankers were keen on that, naturally, but there was political dissension about that, and repeated administrations in the 1960s put obstacles in that way. The U.S. Was not keen on this. And ultimately, so the Nixon taking the dollar off gold in 1971 was just the final blow of that series of attempts to prevent the U.S., to prevent the rise of the dollar system, to prevent the rise of New York as a new London. And Nixon thought maybe he had killed it, but he hadn't. Okay. In fact, what happened was the Eurodollar system, which grew up in London, as a matter of fact, to begin with, because they knew how to run the world. So they're now just, and we can do it in dollars, no problem. It doesn't have to be pound sterling. So it all grew up offshore. Okay. And that's one episode. And then there's a second episode, which is the global financial crisis. And Bob has written about this too. What was the global financial crisis of 2008 or 9? In a way, it was a test of the rising market-based credit system, so-called shadow banking, which was a round trip from the United States to Europe, largely, okay, where we had mortgage-backed securities being issued by U.S. residents, held in Europe, and then funded in global dollar money markets. And that was tested in the global financial crisis, and it broke. And we found out where it broke. What happened after 2008-9? What happened after 2008-9 was that the global market-based credit system grew up again, but now completely offshore, really, or to a much larger extent offshore, with these global bonds being issued in the global south, being funded in Japan, being funded in France. So the dollar system has grown through crises, and it's increasingly offshore. That seems to have squared the political circle. Okay, it's now sort of okay. The Fed acted as global lender of last resort in COVID, and no one made a squeak about it. No one made a squeak about it. That's really quite shocking. Politically speaking, if you in light of this history, that no one called the central banker onto the floor of the Congress and said, "Who gave you permission to lend $700 billion?" No one did that, and yet they did, So I think Kindleberger would see that as progress. I'm not sure everyone would see that as progress.
Maybe before we move on to you, Bob, there's some more questions, but there's one there that I do want to read because it's about Kindleberger directly and maybe changes the topic a bit too and maybe you can also answer, what would he think of blended finance to address climate change? So just kind of want to throw this out there too for our last 5 minutes.
Well, blended finance, you mean private and public? Yes. I think yes. I think there's a role for blended finance. Whether we have the right blend is the question, and probably we don't. Okay, and we'll make mistakes and correct them. But he certainly wasn't a public finance only person or a private finance only person at all. He did think that development was a business thing. This is important, not a charity thing, not a Cold War thing. It's a business thing, and it has to be a business thing in order for money to flow to do it. So he had that sort of, and he thought it could be a business thing, that there were good business opportunities in the global South. But I've talked too much, Bob.
Yeah, no, Bob, whether.
On Eurobonds,
your thoughts on everything.
Eurobonds, Eurodollar market. I should say I'm working on a book called The Global Domain of the Dollar for Cambridge University Press, and I'm digging through some things I never knew. When I started at the New York Fed, they put me on to the Eurobond, Eurodollar bond market, and what I didn't know and only recently learned was not only was that in some ways a creation of the U.S. Treasury, but it was a sort of a knowing creation. It wasn't some financial illiterate or some weak Secretary of Treasury who got rolled by his cabinet. It was, in fact, the son of the Dillon who put his name on Dillon Reed, a major underwriter of foreign bonds in the 1920s, not with a terribly distinguished record when it came to defaults, I might note. But Dillon, his son, after serving as the ambassador to France, for which he was well suited both by his efforts in energy and raising contributions for Eisenhower's presidential campaign, the usual ambassadorial route these days, but also by his family's ownership of Chateau Aubryon, one of the premier Grand Cru Classés vineyards of Bordeaux. Dillon, after some time as economist at the State Department, was made Treasury Secretary by President Kennedy, basically with the sole job of keeping the US dollar and gold a happy couple. And the accounting was terrible in the day because basically the sort of Westphalian approach, the US was looked at as a sort of separate country, just like any other country in the accounting, whereas no account at all was taken of the increasingly global dollar markets. And so the solution that this former chairman of Dillon Reed, Treasury Secretary, probably the most informed man in Washington on the subject of the international bond market, was to export the US foreign bond market, the so-called Yankee bond market, to London with a prohibitive tax. And it succeeded marvelously, just as you would expect something devised in a conversation with the president by the Treasury Secretary himself. And so it wasn't just a kind of cock-up that the dollar bond market immigrated from New York to London for the rest of the world. It was a conscious design by a Wall Street banker whose undersecretary, a guy named Robert Russo, in fact, took bankers to task for worrying more, American bankers to task for worrying more about their profits than about the balance of payments of the United States. In the end, guess who were the biggest underwriters of euro bonds, and not just dollar bonds, but euro denominated bonds and others. Well, the list is will be very familiar to you. It's sort of J.P. Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America. You need to get pretty far down the list before you hit Barclays, and then Morgan Stanley. So in the end, the banks in the United States ended up doing pretty well in London, but that couldn't have been known at the time. But the whole movement, the idea was you could window dress the U.S. accounts under the accounting conventions then in use, which were completely inappropriate, by shifting dollar activity out of the United States, and people who knew very well what they were doing did it on purpose. So it's a funny world we live in, and one consequence, I would say, is that the dollar system has been much more competitive, much less remunerative to the United States economy, much less in the way of rents from the dollar's global use than might have been, or actually was observed under the sterling standard. More to come.
Thank you. And
Fascinating.
More to come, because
yes,
sadly we're out of time and there's so much more to discuss, but hopefully, thank you so much for joining today, and hopefully we'll get to do this again, maybe in different formats too, and people can subscribe to the newsletter so they find out about further publications. Thanks again, Perry and Bob, for joining us, and everyone else. And
thank you, Laura.
Sorry that we didn't get to address everything.